Well, thank you so much for
sleep with the lights on.
thank you so much for turning out tonight. I really appreciate you coming out. Our talk today is going to be about boat building in Michigan, and our first boat builders were really Native American canoe builders in the state, and a lot of those were women that were building the canoes using techniques to sew together pieces of birch bark and also to form different canoes of different sizes for the different kinds of waterways that we have throughout the state. You had large canoes for open water work and then smaller ones for rivers. Here you see a few of the canoes that were used up on the St. Mary's River up by Sault Ste. Marie. And these are kind of unusual because they used European style building techniques. You see sort of a lap strake plank construction that they had. And they would take passengers down through the rapids that existed at Sault Ste. Marie, but also do commercial fishing in that area up until the rapids were eliminated by the creation of locks. Now, before we had pleasure boats, a lot of our boats were work boats. You see a small dinghy that's hanging off the stern of a schooner that was used on the Great Lakes here. And they would use those dinghies to row into the harbors to pick up supplies if they couldn't dock nearby. And then also they used it for repairs and also sometimes even hauling the anchor if it was calm weather. One of the early forms of boats that was used in the state was what they call Mackinaw boats. And these are sort of like the pickup truck of the Great Lakes, if you will. And they're usually a double-ended craft. A lot of times they had two masts. This particular one has a single mast. But they were used for commercial fishing. They were used for hauling small cargoes from port city to port city. A lot of them were used in the Mackinac region. And there's still remnants of one of them up in St. Ignace today. But they were really a popular form of watercraft. And again, the first kind of boat of its type in the Great Lakes region. And they get their origins from the Drontheim boats that were used in Ireland. And they brought that technology over into the Great Lakes region with early settlers. It isn't until about the 1830s and 40s, when after Michigan became a state, that we had the beginnings of leisure time, when people had available time and money to build their own boats. And here you see the early Detroit Boat Club, which is one of the oldest boat clubs within the entire United States. And they would host rowing competitions. It was a popular form of boat racing in its day. They also conducted sail racing and things like that too. It's really the growth of the railroad network throughout the state. Usually first in the southern parts of the state, with the Michigan Central and Michigan Southern Railways, but also railroads that went northward up into the areas like Traverse City and also Petoskey and places like that. And building the resorts is really what promoted small craft manufacturing within the state. The railroads would go to a particular lakefront, for instance, and they would build resort hotels, and then people would stay at the hotels. But what do you do for fun around here? So you start bringing in boats for rowing and for commercial fishing and things like that, or recreational fishing, I should say. This is a scene at Reed's Lake that shows a boat livery, but also the steamer Victor over on the far right-hand side. Reed's Lake is over in East Grand Rapids. And it's a little bitty lake. It's about 1.5 miles long, I think, and about 1 mile wide. And it too became one of these large community resorts for the city of Grand Rapids. And they had a small iron steamer named the Sport, which I believe is the one on the left here. And then rowboats that were available for rent, just to go out for a leisurely row around the lake, or also to do some fishing on your own. And a lot of times the steamer would go take the boats out, drop them off at different parts of the lake by towing them basically, and then dropping them off and then picking them up at the end of the day so that the fishermen could come home. One of the important early builders of recreational boats was Christopher Columbus Smith of Algonac. And he was a decoy duck manufacturer. You can see from this 1885 ad. He later goes on to form Chris Craft Corporation. And you see dogs broken to hunt. He was one of these guys that really did all kinds of different things, but he was well known as a decoy duck manufacturer, but also built small boats for hunting and recreation. And he was not the only one. There were other places, other people that were building things all over the state. There was Thomas Allen over by Springwells down near Detroit. George Pryor up in Marquette. You know, even the miners needed to do some fun stuff every once in a while. And then Ira Kendricks is over in Port Huron. And they were all building rowboats, yawl boats for the schooners and passenger steamers. They were doing ship repairing. So they're doing kind of all sorts of different things in the 1870s to assist in keeping their recreational boat businesses going. Charles Plast over by Orchard Lake was building racing yachts, sail yachts, and he also built boats down in Detroit. And so he would be another one of those kind of guys that would build small recreational boats early on. Now imagine what it was like riding an early steam launch as your first sort of recreational boat ride. You're usually sitting on top of the load of coal that was used to power the boat and getting, you know, filled with coal dust, and it was usually hissing steam and cinders coming out of the top of the stack. The guy in the bow of the boat here is carrying a hunting gun for trying to hunt waterfowl probably, and you had to have a licensed steam engineer, which is the guy in the vest managing the engine, and then one other person that was also doing the hunting. And so this is what an early excursion boat or fun boat ride was all about in the early years. This probably took place in like the St. Clair Flats area. Now, if you had a lot of money, you could buy your own steam yacht. This one was built by John Craig, who was a shipbuilder down in Gibraltar, Michigan, and it was called Sigma. And it was about, I think, 120 feet or something like that for size. And he built it for a gentleman who ran a lot of the railroads, Martin J. Smith. One of the early prominent small boat manufacturing companies was called Detroit Boat Works. And they actually built electric boats for the Chicago Exposition in 1893. Little electric launches that would go around through all the different lagoons and drop passengers off. And so they built something like 38 of these different boats, I believe. And that was one of the main things. Frank Kirby, the famous naval architect, was the president of the company for a while. One of their other products was actually to build a submarine. And this is a oak-hulled submarine built for George Baker of Chicago by Detroit Boat Works right in Detroit. And it was tested in River Rouge in the 1890s. And it had electric motors and a steam engine to power it. And it went down to a depth of about 12 feet underwater. And George Baker tried to sell it to the Navy, but unfortunately he contracted appendicitis and died before they could transact the sale. And so his wife emptied out the boat, and it's supposedly sunk somewhere in southern Lake Michigan. So we don't know that for sure, but that's a story that's been passed down. So one of Michigan's first submarines. More typical, I guess, would be Spring Lake Clinker Boat Manufacturing Company, which is a really long name for a really small firm, and usually employed about 4 to 7 people. It was one of the earlier incorporated companies in Michigan, and they would build boats in this little clapboard side or board and mat and siding building, and then ship them by railroad throughout the country. People would order them by mail order, and then you would get your boat from them. And it's still around today as an organization as part of Barrett Boat Works over in Spring Lake. And it's more of a marina operation, but the roots of it go back to the Spring Lake Clinker Boat Manufacturing Company. Another guy that got involved in the business of building boats was a jeweler by the name of Nathaniel Osgood. And in the back of his little downtown storefront in Battle Creek, Michigan, he had 4 little workstations where women would sew together the hulls of these collapsible boats. And you could pack this up into a duffel bag or a box and carry it by horseback to your favorite lake, unpack it, lay out the center board that held the thing together, and then row out and do your fishing from this. And these became really popular as a kind of boat during the Alaskan gold rush in the 1890s because it was collapsible. There's a lot of waterways up that way that you could transport yourself to the mining fields in a boat like this that you would carry in a box or a bag. And so there's still a lot of packages of those boats up in Alaska. Another gentleman that was really active in building boats and engines was Clark Sins. And he was the developer of the two-cycle engine that's commonly used on lawnmowers today. And he formed Wolverine Motor Works, which was a small boat building operation. Originally got started in Grand Rapids, and then it moved to Holland, Michigan, right on Lake Macatawa. And they would launch boats right out of there. The company gets bought out, and Clark Sins actually moves to Detroit, where he forms the Sins Gas Engine Company. And then Wolverine ends up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and lasted into, I believe, the 1940s or 1950s as an engine manufacturer. But you can see here one of Clark Sins's early engines. It's this huge, very, very heavy, probably 200, 300-pound flywheel of solid iron. It's a single cylinder. They hadn't developed the spark plug yet, and so that was all flame ignition. And not the easiest thing to run or start, but this is what an early power boat engine looked like. It's the places like the Detroit Boat Club and other yacht clubs throughout the state that really fund the development of racing boats, and they also are the ones who determine the sport's rules. As you can imagine, in the early years of power boating, there were all kinds of different boat sizes and boat horsepowers and engines, so they had to come up with these handicapping systems for making the races fair and even to the best of their ability. And it was the yacht clubs that usually helped on setting those rules. But they also were able to finance large institutional buildings like this that provided a social setting for the boats and boaters. One of the early prominent manufacturers in the state was Truscott Boat Manufacturing Company. And Thomas Truscott gets his start in Grand Rapids, but he loses his factory to a fire and is invited by the city of St. Joseph to relocate their plant down there. This is down in the southwest corner of the state, down by Benton Harbor and St. Joe. And so in this particular photo, you see several different kinds of boats being constructed at the same time. That there was not a standard boat that was built for a while, and then you move on to the next model, but you would build everything as orders came in, either by phone or telegraph, and you would build the boat here, sometimes in pieces, and then the workers would come, do their work on the boat, and then have to go back and get the lumber and the fasteners and everything else, take it back to the boat, continue their work that way. They hadn't come up with the idea of a moving assembly line for boats yet. And so this is what an early boat shop would look like. And Truscott became pretty famous. They built boats for the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. They marketed their boats through all sorts of different magazines and employed about 250 people. It was that big of a business. Another big one was called Racine Boat Manufacturing Company, which actually was relocated from Racine, Wisconsin, where they had lost their plant to fire, to Muskegon. And they build these boats in Muskegon on Muskegon Lake in a big factory that extended out over the water. And they built large cruisers, they built all sorts of things, even light ships, floating lighthouses, if you will, that were stationed throughout the Great Lakes region. And this became a large integrated manufacturer. They built their own engines, they built their own hulls, and we were able to ship these boats all over the country. There were people out in Washington State that would buy Racine boats for their use. But it got its start, and it ended up becoming part of a sort of a General Motors-like conglomerate, if you will, that failed in 1915. They tried to create what was called the National Boat and Engine Company by merging, I think it was 12 different firms together. And it happened right at the same time when the Standard Oil business was being broken up for trust issues. And so, so the company fails. It sort of resurrects itself in 1915 as a Racine Truscott Shell Lake Boat Company, for those three boat companies all merged together, but it too fails eventually. Another important kind of business that we had in Michigan was the knockdown boat building industry over in the Saginaw Valley, where it was really prominent. These were boats that were kind of interesting in the way they started. There was a fellow by the name of Clifford Brooks, who was a former newspaperman and sailor, who one day was watching his wife sew a dress on their dining room table. He said, hey, what if we take those same paper patterns and put them on pieces of wood, cut out the wood to those patterns, and then ship them as a kit to be built by somebody. You know, you could save 2/3 of the cost of the boat that way. And so he forms a company called Brooks Boat Manufacturing Company in Bay City. And within 4 or 5 years, he's building over 10,000 boats a year in kit form. And this is way more than anybody else is building at that time. And you would get the boat parts delivered to you by mail order in crates like this. And then you could have your friends or neighbors or somebody else. Notice the guy on the left-hand side here standing watching his friend or neighbor help him build the boat that they would both enjoy later on for a few years, you know. So, but it would come as a kit of parts, and you could take the instructions that came with the boat and launch it and enjoy a good ride around lakes. Another kind of different technology that was used was steel boat manufacturing here in Michigan. You could actually get started over in Kalamazoo, where they invented a process by which the metal planks that are on the outside of the boat, they look like overlapping planks, basically. They would interlock with U-shaped joints, sort of like a stovepipe, if you know anything about, well, like the stovepipe that probably went to the stove behind me here. It interlocks together with two U-shaped joints. And they would attach the planking to wooden frames that way. And then the same company, the Michigan Steel Boat Company, also manufactured its own engines in an 8-acre plant right in downtown Detroit. And they would ship these usually off to places that had a boat livery or people that rent out boats, because they're really durable. You know, being steel hulled, it took a lot of abuse. And they had flotation tanks in the front and in the back, the bow and the stern, to help keep the boat afloat in case of an emergency. Now, during World War I, Michigan boat builders helped contribute a little bit to the war effort. Because our lakes are frozen over for much of the year, we couldn't contribute a large number of boats. And what the Navy needed was far different from what we could supply. But as Mike was talking about, Ford Motor Company got involved in shipbuilding with the Eagle boats that were built in downtown Detroit. Some 10,000 people worked in the Eagle boat submarine chaser plants. Another company was the Digital Carter Boat Company down in Benton Harbor. And that a lot of times yachtsmen would have boats built for the Navy as their contribution to the war effort. And this was a boat called Miss Toledo that was built for that effort. And you can see it's sort of a military-looking boat that would have been used for shore patrol or river patrols. There weren't too many of them that were built here in the state, but it was our one contribution to the war effort. The other thing was that we used a lot of were aircraft engines that were built during the war that were later incorporated into boats for boat racing. Harry Defoe up in Bay City was another guy who got involved in boat building. He was building yachts for the people who made their money in the automobile industry. And he had a big factory there. Down in the lower right-hand corner of the photo, you see a number of different little wooden runabouts. Those were subcontracted from Horace Dodge's firm to be built by Defoe Boat and Motor Works. And so in the 1920s, it became one of the leading yacht manufacturers in the state because it could undercut the costs significantly with the workforce that was here in the state. But Defoe Boat and Motor Works lasts until the 1960s in Bay City. Oops. Two of the important people that worked together early on are Christopher Columbus Smith, the same guy that I talked about as the boat and duck decoy manufacturer. He's the man on the lower right-hand side there. And then Garfield Arthur Wood, who is sitting on top of his boat. And Gar Wood was the guy who invented the hydraulic automobile hoist for dump trucks to raise and lower the beds of dump trucks, and built quite a fortune, millions of dollars of fortune, and enabled him to build racing boats. And his boats were a series that were called, first of all, Miss America 1, and then, or Miss Detroit 1, and then 2, 3, 4, and so on. And then also Miss America boats. But he got started in boat racing by working on his dad's excursion boat in Lake Osakis in Minnesota. And he started winning races with powerful boats that were designed here in Michigan, starting in 1920 and continuing on through 1933 at the height of the Great Depression. And he won the Gold Cup races some 4 times and set numerous world water speed records with boats that were built here in the state. And he really, it was probably Garwood's racing that really popularized recreational boating in the state at the time. And so here you see a photo of Miss Detroit. It has a bow rudder. If you look way underneath the forward part of the boat, it has a large engine, Stirling engine. Later on, they were using Curtiss engines, aircraft engines, and things like that. But it was a very fast kind of boat for hydroplane racing. And then a subsequent series was called the Miss America series of hydroplanes. And he would compete internationally with other people who come to the United States to set world water or world land speed records with different cars and boats, including people like Sir Henry Seagrave and Hubert Scott Payne. And the wooden boats that were built by Chris Smith for Gar Wood were this Miss America series. And here you see Miss America 10 with 4 large engines of some 6,400 horsepower. This is about as much as 3 steam locomotives of its time in a 40-foot long boat. And so it was very fast, and this boat is still around today. You can see it at different boat shows, although it's been repowered significantly, but the boat itself is still around, and was built in 1932, I believe. And you can see just lots of horsepower and lots of weight. Chris Smith and Gar Wood ended their collaboration about 1922 and decided to go in 2 different directions. Wood wanted to continue racing, and so he built racing boats, but he also developed Gar Wood Inc., which is private recreational boats designed for the wealthy. And then Chris Smith would build boats for more family-oriented use. You see here a 22-foot runabout. It has the engine in the center. You have places for the captain and his family up in the forward part and also in the stern part of the boat. Fuel tank way in the stern. But it was a very fast boat with automobile type of power to it. And the Chris Smith, C.C. Smith and Sons boat plant in Algonac became the largest boat building plant in the world in the late 1920s. They were building boats that were sold all over the country and all over the world, on several different acres of property there. It's since been turned into condominiums, and you can still drive by what used to be the plant area. Another prominent builder and designer was John L. Hacker. And Hacker had no formal training in designing boats. He worked for his dad and the dad's ice dealership. They were harvesting ice over on Lake Orion, and he was the bookkeeper for the firm. But he got into designing boats by attending or taking mail order classes through books, and developed an excellent eye for fine line. And the Hacker Boat Company still exists today in upstate New York, and you can still find his designs being built even now. But his boats too were very fast, very elegant type of craft. Whoop, not. There we go. One of the boats I designed was called the Belle Isle Bearcat. And this is being driven by actress Peggy Wood out in California. But this is one of the boats that had a very powerful engine and was very capable of very high speeds. It too was very similar to the Chris Crafts and other boats of its time, but the Hacker boats were kind of a higher quality. They were known as the Steinway of boats, if you will. And they used copper fasteners, clinch nails, and things like that to hold the hull together. They used very powerful engines. The early ones were built by the Van Blert Company down in Detroit, and then subsequently by Kermath and other large engine manufacturers in the Detroit area. It's really those same Detroit area engine manufacturers that really stoked the industry within the state. We had over 250 engine manufacturers that built marine engines just in Michigan, and most of them concentrated in the southwest or southeast part of the state, but there's also places like Mansalona, Michigan, that had the Eclipse Motor Company that was making marine engines for small craft, and some that were over on the west side of the state. So one of the Hacker designs that appeared early on was the Century Thunderbolt. It was a one-design racer that he designed primarily for his son. His son was one of the founding members of the Century Boat Company up in Manistee. And this is the kind of boats that they built that got that company started in the recreational business. And it was prominent in Michigan up until the 1970s when it moved out of state. Another big influence on Michigan boat building was rum running and rum chasers, because they both needed fast boats, right? And you could see it was kind of an interesting place where we had a mile-wide river that separated us from Canada, and you could easily take any kind of boat across a river in about 5 minutes or less. Especially a fast boat could go a lot faster. And this is where 75% of the alcohol came into the country from, was across the Detroit River. And according to Phil Mason, who was written a book on the subject. And because you were close to the distilleries and you had this narrow waterway, it was a lot of islands and channels, enclosed boathouses where you could hide your boat. It really made the perfect environment for smuggling alcohol across the border. Now here you see one of the slower boats that got caught, and the cargo is going over the side where it's been kept in a cool, dark place for over 100 years now. And so there's a lot of this still on the bottom, presumably, or small quantity of it, I should say, of boats that were confiscated. But I've been trying to go through some of the older records of boat seizures. Who was getting caught, and there's not much of people that got caught doing this kind of work. The Michigan State Police had 4 Chris Craft runabouts, and then they were housed with a mothership called the Aladdin, and worked out on the Detroit River here. The city of Detroit had a little boat that they used to chase down rum runners. And then it isn't until like the late 1920s, early 1930s that you get the Customs Service involved and faster boats that help mitigate some of the traffic, but it was still just rampant, wide open waters for people to smuggle booze across the border. One of the prominent boat builders that was building some of Hacker's cruisers was a fellow by the name of Ben Huskin up in Bay City, Michigan. And one of the boats that he built was called Thunderbird, John Hacker design. And this is a boat that now lives out on Lake Tahoe, and it was known as the 70-mile-an-hour cocktail lounge because because it was owned by Bill Hara of Harrah's in Reno, and they would take it out for cruises and have a really good time. And you can now charter this boat for weddings and whatnot. It even appears on a U.S. postal stamp, and was a very prominent boat. It had all stainless steel upper superstructure and then mahogany hull, and still capable of pretty high speeds. Other kinds of boats that were built in Michigan were for different kinds of environments. We had a lot of commercial fishing boats that were built in the state. Wayno-Winnica up in Chazell, Michigan, way up in near Houghton, Hancock area, built the Atlantis here. And you can see some of the harsh conditions that these boats were operating in. They would run really late into the season when the ice got too thick. They had to stop, but they were also out early in the spring. And it was boats like this that had to be built very sturdily to survive in those kinds of conditions. We had some really interesting designs of other kinds of boats. Charles Stiver, who was a boat builder down in Saginaw, Michigan, built boats out of magnesium, which was called Dow Metal at the time because they were the Dow Metal manufacturers, a Dow Chemical Company. And these were really lightweight canoes and were forerunners in the late 1930s of what are now the aluminum canoes that you see, the Grumman canoes and things like that. But it was really Charles Stiver who was one of the pioneers in building those really lightweight canoes. And I love this ad because it says it's safe even for children. You know, send your kid out on the rivers with this. Michigan played a really important part in World War II in terms of providing watercraft to the armed forces. If it wasn't for Michigan-built landing craft, they wouldn't have been able to invade Europe or the Pacific Islands. It was boats built by Chris Craft Corporation. They built over, I think it was over 12,000 of these small landing craft of this type. There was Defoe Shipbuilding Company up in Bay City that was building destroyer escorts. They would build them upside down with the hull inverted because it was easier to weld downwards than it was to weld upwards when you were assembling the hull. There's other builders. There was Fisher Boatworks just down Jefferson Avenue here that built prototypes like a PT-3 here, a prototype torpedo boat. It was a little too small for the designed intended use, but it showed how Michigan manufacturers were taking the initiative of trying to help the Navy out to figure out the kinds of boats that were going to be successful. Dagel Carter Company, the same shipbuilding company that was around during World War I, was building minesweepers and mine layers out of plywood during World War II. And they would hire local kids to make little wooden plugs to fill all the screw holes with on these wooden boats. And again, you had a very limited season by which they could build the boats, get them launched, and then send them across over the oceans. They had to be shipped out either through the St. Lawrence Seaway or through the Mississippi River to get them out to the open ocean. And we even had a boat building firm up in Traverse City called, I think it was Traverse City Shipbuilding Company that built patrol craft for use on submarine chasing. Eddy Shipbuilding Corporation over in Bay City built small launches for towing around those landing craft that were being built by the other manufacturers. After the war, boat builders faced all sorts of different new challenges. Sometimes there were material shortages and things like plywood. There was also new materials that they could select from. Because of the way that people had learned how to build aircraft out of aluminum, they learned how to build boats out of aluminum that's using that same technology. It was the same kind of riveting. It was just a different form and a lot simpler than an airplane, for instance. You also had fiberglass that was used for helmets, liners, and casts of different kinds. All sorts of new materials. And so material selection became a big decision for a lot of the manufacturers. You also have automobile styling. You have the look of tail fins that's modeled after airplanes like the P-38 Lightning and later on jets. The wraparound cockpit windshields that are transparent are derived right from cockpits of jet aircraft. And so they have a lot of the same kind of look and effect of early boats that were built right after the war. T. Dale Vanette was a builder up in Escanaba, Michigan, who built the Isle Royal Queen II, which was a ferry that went out to Isle Royal. He was a U.S. Navy diver who learned his welding skills during the war and took it back home to Escanaba, where he built a larger boat building firm. They also built recreational boats and also some ferries and things like that. Whoops. Hang on a second here. There we go. Harwell Incorporated out of St. Charles, again near Saginaw, built aerocraft boats. These are riveted aluminum boats. Leon Harkins and I forget his first name, but the last name is Wiltsey, put together this company right after the war to build boats using the same technology that they had learned at Briggs Aircraft Corporation that was building wings for bombers. And then Wagemaker Company was actually an old furniture manufacturer in Grand Rapids, and they were building molded plywood hulled boats, like you see here. This is a 1951 molded plywood hull. And what they would do is they would have these big presses that would put a squeeze on several sheets of plywood and bond them together and build a very strong, durable hull that was really good for families to use. Century Boat Company up in Manistee built boats like the Century Coronado. And you see, again, the automobile styling comes into play here with the two-tone paint jobs. You have the vinyl roof, the wraparound windshield, all those things that are started out on cars later get incorporated into boats. Some were not so successful. Turner Enterprises down in Quincy, Michigan, made a fiberglass boat called the Glass Slipper, but it was never really a hot seller because it was a little too far out there in terms of its styling. And so Turnercraft boats today are very, very rare and therefore very, very expensive. And but you can still find a few of them out and around. But this would be an example of a company that didn't really excel and become famous later on. John Hacker, the same John Hacker that was prominent in the 1920s, continued building racing boats or designing racing boats in the post-war era, including boats called My Sweetie and Miss Pepsi. Miss Pepsi is down at the Dawson Great Lakes Museum in that little enclosure that they have outside their building. But one of the boats he designed was called My Sweetie. And they would use World War II aircraft engines, usually an Allison aircraft engine in these high-speed hydroplane boats. Some of them became very successful, what they call the three-pointer style. And Les Staudiker of Caw Call, Michigan, over by Bay City, was one of these designers. He was a church pew manufacturer for his main occupation, but got into building racing boats, and he built several very prominent ones that became world famous. He even drove some of the boats himself. He really broke up his body pretty badly in an accident on Hubbard Lake up in northern Michigan, driving a jet-powered boat using a jet engine. And lost control of the rudder, or the rudder broke off at 200 miles an hour, and he ended up on shore the hard way. But, okay. One of the boats that he designed, though, was Such Crust Schaefer Bread Company. Got into the racing industry, and again, they were using these war surplus aircraft engines to power the boats. And you see the tall tail fin and the three-point hull, it was called, for racing. The Rooster Tail Restaurant gets its name from that big plume of spray that came up after the boats. Arena Craft was built not too far from here in Mount Clemens, Michigan. And Dan Arena was a prominent boat racer who was from California, and he built the boats here for a little while. They were very high-powered, small runabouts, usually 2-passenger, 3-passenger, but had a pretty powerful engine and fiberglass design, and became pretty famous for a little while. And then he moves the company back out to California. Leon Slickers over in Holland, Michigan, forms a company called Slickcraft. He got his start by working for Chris Craft, and when Chris Craft went on strike one year, he decided to spread his own wings and get into the boat building industry on his own. So over in Holland, Michigan, he forms Slickcraft. And like many of the manufacturers of that time frame, what happens is that the small builders get bought out by conglomerates. And then the conglomerates decide that maybe they don't need to follow what the original designer had in mind so much. And so Slickers was bought out by AMF Corporation, and he lost control of the company essentially, and decided to go out and build boats again, this time sailboats called S2 yachts for Slickers Part 2. And nowadays the company's still around as Tierra Yachts, and you might have seen a few of those around. Okay. Whoop. Sorry. John and Bill Wynn formed Four Winds Boat Company in Cadillac, Michigan. And they were actually boat salesmen who worked for George Spicer. You might have heard of Spicer Boat Works up by Houghton Lake, the same family anyway. And George Spicer hired these two guys to sell boats for him under the name Safety Mate. And so they're going along, they're in their 20s and early 30s, salesmen, and the company's just not doing real well. They're making a living, but it's not prospering like they really want it to. And Spicer's getting kind of old. He wants to retire. And so he tells the two Wynn brothers, either you buy me out or you're fired. And so using that motivation, they went to their father, who was a vice president of a motorcycle company, BMF, I think, motorcycles, and or BSA motorcycles, and got him to provide the funding to start up the plant. It loses its factory in a fire in the early 1970s, but the local community really built the factory back up by pulling out the original molds or some of the original boats and using them to splash a new mold off of. And so it continues today as one of the prominent manufacturers in Michigan. Sea Ray Boats over in Oxford, Michigan, was an early pioneer in fiberglass in the state. And they were really well known for the way they designed the interior of the boats. They used automotive styling for the fit and finish. Prior to this time, nobody really cared about what the inside of the boat looked like. It was more about the outside look of the boat. And so he was one of the first to really develop what a fine-looking boat would look like on the inside. And then up to the present day, pontoons are the hot item today. And we have Avalon and Tahoe pontoons that are made up in Alma, Michigan. And this is usually an outboard powered boat, different sizes. That some of them have fishing wells. They're pretty high speed nowadays. Much different from the pontoon boats that we grew up with. There's a Great Lakes Boat Building School up in Cedarville, Michigan, that trains people how to build boats. And so we have centers that do that kind of work throughout the state. Some places have internships for boat builders to help students that want to get started in the industry. And so that's how the industry gets carried on today. And it's still very much a family tradition. Steve and Ben Van Dam operate Van Dam Boat Works up in Boyne City, Michigan. And the little boy that you say standing next to his dad is now the project manager for the firm. And so it really is a family-oriented business in some ways. And they build custom wooden boats of different kinds. So if you're interested in studying boat building history, you can look at old city directories, which have a lot of information about where a company was located, who owned it. Sometimes you can derive who the workforce was out of those city directories. There's information in the census records that you can track down a certain builder and see who they were related to, for instance. There's Ancestry.com can tell you family ties of the different boat builders. Sanborn insurance maps, which are maps of the buildings that existed in different cities, and they show you the plant layout. For instance, where the foundry would have been in like the old Truscott plant in 1904, for instance. you can look up that kind of information in the Sanborn maps. There's a lot of boat building periodicals that are out there. Motor Boating Magazine, going back to the 1910s or earlier. People like Jeffrey Reynolds up in Charlevoix, Michigan. He's collected a lot of oral histories on different boat builders. And there's also records that are at local historical societies that would keep those kinds of things. And if you're interested in finding out more about a particular boat company, always ask your local library and librarians. So that concludes my presentation, and thank you so much for coming out tonight.